I'm Iris Howe in for Steve Lance. President Trump postponing higher tariffs on Mexico as foreign leaders are phoning him with new offers. The latest on the president's trade actions now just hours away before fresh tariffs are set to kick in.
Foreign leaders are ringing his phone, realizing this deadline is a real thing for them tomorrow, and they're bringing offers to the table.
Dozens of countries are set to face fresh U.S. tariffs starting midnight on Friday. Mexico getting some last-minute relief as President Trump announces it's giving the southern neighbor a 90-day reprieve from a 30% tariff that was set to take effect.
We have made a few deals today that are excellent deals for the country. You know, we're taking in literally trillions of dollars for the country.
Said we will continue to talk to Mexico over the next 90 days with the goal of signing a larger trade deal.
On Wednesday, the president announced a new deal with South Korea, whose team came to him with new offers. But on Thursday, the president casting doubt on reaching a deal with Canada after the country said it would recognize a Palestinian state.
Not a deal breaker, but we haven't spoken to Canada today. He's called.
Without a deal, U.S. tariffs are set to jump to 35% on Canadian imports. The White House, though, stressing that more deals could land before midnight. In another move, the president sending letters to heads of 17 pharmaceutical companies, pressing them to lower drug prices here in the U.S. in the next 2 months. The press secretary reading out a letter he sent to Eli Lilly.
Moving forward, the only thing I will accept from drug manufacturers is a commitment that provides American families immediate relief from the vastly inflated drug prices and an end to the free ride of American innovation by European and other developed nations.
Specifically, the president is calling on these companies to extend the most favored nation pricing to Medicaid and also return increased revenues abroad to American patients and taxpayers. And joining me now to discuss the latest developments with President Trump's trade deals is EJ Antoni, chief economist at the Heritage Foundation's Center for the Federal Budget. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So the U.S. and Mexico have now agreed to extend their tariff talks for another 90 days. President Trump says, quote, "The complexities of a deal with Mexico are somewhat different than other nations because of both their problems and assets of the border." What's your reaction to this, and what do you hope is going into the discussions?
Well, I think this was a very wise move by the Trump administration because thus far we have seen a Mexican government that's negotiating in good faith. We have seen considerable concessions already. They've done tremendous work to help us secure the border. You know, the fact that we still need more funding to secure the border, Doug Homan will tell you that, speaks to how much help we're getting from Mexico. We don't actually have enough funding right now to actually keep our border secure. So again, the fact that it is secure, that just demonstrates how much help we have gotten from the Mexican government. So they've helped on, I should say they've given us some concessions on both economic and non-economic issues. And I think the administration is also wise to recognize the complexities that are at play here, especially in industries like automotive, where you will have car parts or component pieces that cross the U.S. and Mexican border literally half a dozen times before final assembly into a vehicle. And you don't want each of those border crossings to continuously hit products with tariffs and ultimately harm American consumers.
I mean, well, with some other countries, we are seeing Trump's strategies of tariff pressure seemingly paying off. For example, the EU is planning to buy U.S. energy, and the Japanese market is also opening up to U.S. cars. What would you say are the biggest wins so far for the United States?
Well, the EU and Japan definitely have to be up there because these are places where for the last 80 years, this is not an exaggeration, for 80 years now, we have allowed nations in Europe and we have allowed Japan to throw up all kinds of both tariff and non-tariff barriers to keep out American competition. That has given our exporters and the workers who are in export-based industries a tremendous disadvantage here in the United States. In fact, in many cases, you just can't be competitive at any price because of things like quota restrictions, again, whether it's Japan or whether it's Europe. So the fact that the president was able to overturn literally 80 years of precedent here and give us unprecedented access to both European and Japanese consumer markets is a tremendous win that will boost demand for American exports, which also boosts the demand for American labor that makes those exports. That will lead to not only more American jobs in those industries, but also faster wage growth. And that's something we desperately need right now to claw out from the last 4 years of inflation here at home.
I mean, while the White House says that the U.S. has now struck a tailor-made trade deals with 2/3 of its major trading partners, but there are still dozens, if not hundreds, of other countries who have yet to get a deal and are just going to be hit with a letter potentially. Do you see any downsides with the current negotiations and potentially the uncertainty with it?
Well, there's always downsides with uncertainty, but those downsides extend not only to domestic markets, but foreign markets as well. In other words, all of the uncertainty that has been caused by tariffs here at home has created as much, if not more, uncertainty abroad, I would estimate. And so the result of that is it puts more pressure on foreign leaders than it puts on our own domestic ones in order to get a deal done. And part of the reason for that, I think, is that even though there are no winners in trade wars, there are only losers. Not everyone loses the same. And if you look at the relationship between, let's say, Canada and the United States, it is just blatantly obvious to anyone who has gone through the numbers that China would lose, or excuse me, that Canada would lose far more in a trade war than the United States would. And so ultimately, I think that means nations like Canada, who are in that position, are ultimately just going to have to give in to what the president's asking for.
And the president could now set a new minimum baseline tariff on all goods entering the U.S., of course, starting tonight. Do you expect that to potentially go up from the current 10%?
Well, it's certainly possible. I think we're going to probably have to look at this on a case-by-case basis when it comes to trying to forecast what the president is going to do. Again, if you have nations that are negotiating in good faith, I think we're likely to see those rates not go up. I think we're likely to see, in fact, more extensions or pauses put in place so that negotiations can continue, again, provided they're in good faith. But for the nations that have not been acting in good faith, I would say all bets are off. And don't be surprised if we see punitively high trade restrictions like tariffs put in place in those instances. And look, I'm not advocating for these things. I'm just trying to help folks understand that this seems to be the methodology with which this White House is approaching the problem.
And lastly, before I let you go here, the U.S. economy just saw a 3% growth in the second quarter, more than expected. According to the Commerce Department, the rebound mainly reflects a decrease in imports. Can we read into this as an impact of the tariffs so far, or is it still too early to tell?
Well, it's certainly very early to tell, but the information that we do have, in other words, the numbers for the first half of the year, tell a very clear story. We basically have a complete flip-flop from the first quarter to the second quarter. In other words, all of the impact from imports exploding in the first quarter was simply undone in the second quarter. Likewise, the massive buildup in business inventories that added in the first quarter was replaced with a huge drawdown of inventories in the second quarter. So these wild fluctuations, which clearly are from the uncertainties around tariff, virtually canceled each other out between the first and the second quarter. In fact, if you look at the combined cumulative impact on GDP between international trade and also business inventories, it amounted to just 0.1% of GDP. So it was essentially a non-issue. But what we are seeing this year, for the first 6 months, is we have seen literally no growth in government purchases. That's fabulous news. All of our increased economic activity is coming from the productive private sector, and it's being driven by an increase in consumer spending, as well as an increase in business investment. Again, this is very positive news and a stark change from the 4 years under Biden, when GDP was disproportionately boosted by debt-fueled spending binges on the part of the federal government.
Well, certainly a new track right now for government spending, but more changes remain to be seen with how it's going to impact everything else when fluctuations settle down. EJ Antoni, thank you so much for your insights today. Appreciate it. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is in Israel, where he met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today. This comes as Israel continues to receive international scrutiny on the humanitarian aid situation in the Gaza Strip. NTD's Jason Perry has the story.
A motorcade in Jerusalem, believed to be carrying U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, was seen arriving at the Israeli Prime Minister's office. On Thursday, Witkoff and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu held talks over the situation in the Gaza Strip. The White House said the U.S. will be hearing firsthand about the humanitarian situation in the territory.
Tomorrow, Special Envoy Witkoff and Ambassador Huckabee will be traveling into Gaza to inspect the current distribution sites and secure a plan to deliver more food and meet with local Gazans to hear firsthand about this dire situation on the ground.
Their meeting also comes after both the U.S. and Israel said they are now considering alternative options to return the hostages still held by Hamas. And on the same day in Jerusalem, the mother of a hostage wiped her tears at a rally calling for the release of the remaining hostages.
President Trump, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and Witkoff, please end this nightmare for all the Israeli people. End this nightmare for all the families that cannot live anymore. End this nightmare for the hostages in the tunnels.
Meanwhile, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or GHF, which is backed by the U.S. and Israel, said they have distributed almost 100 million meals since they began operations at the end of May. The GHF says they deliver aid directly to residents and not to Hamas. However, the United Nations has accused the GHF's method of distributing aid as, quote, inherently unsafe and a violation of humanitarian impartiality rules. Meanwhile,
don't do this, no.
The United Nations released footage of their humanitarian aid convoy being taken over by thousands of people in the territory. Israel has said the UN method of delivering aid allows Hamas to steal it and then use it to support its terrorist activities. In another development across Israel's northern border, Lebanon is stepping up calls for the Hezbollah terrorist group to give up their weapons. Hezbollah has exerted much control over southern Lebanon and has told the Lebanese government that they don't plan to give up their weapons, saying this would benefit Israel. The leader of Hezbollah also said that their weapons, quote, have nothing to do with Lebanon's internal affairs. Jason Perry, NTD News.
The defense budget could be slashed by $40 billion. The Senate Appropriations Committee reaches a bipartisan consensus. Our Washington correspondent Luis Martinez has the details on this story.
You've got authoritarian regimes coordinating with each other. The North Koreans, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranian proxies, all communicating. And the one thing they have in common, they hate us.
In a divided Congress, senators have found common ground when addressing U.S. national security threats, in particular the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party and its anti-American axis.
Deterring China, standing with Ukraine, standing up to the increasing coordination of the People's Republic of China, Russia, Iran, and the DPRK, and modernizing the DoD with a sense of urgency because the clock is ticking.
The bipartisan consensus in the Appropriations Committee yielded a nearly $40 billion spending cut, the second year in a row that defense spending is reduced, not increased.
This bill reduces waste and duplication by making hundreds of cuts to underperforming programs and realigning those billions of dollars in savings into higher priority programs.
It expands critical munitions production, including air and missile defense interceptors, long-range missiles, and next-generation hypersonic weapons developed by our most innovative firms. It funds drone and counter-drone technologies.
The bipartisan bill also makes an important investment in the service members and their families.
From a pay increase for service members to robust child care funding, to new investments in preventing suicide and sexual assault, and conducting life-saving medical research. So I really appreciate the work that went into negotiating these important investments.
The Senate Appropriations Committee has already passed half of the funding bills for fiscal year 2026, and the full Senate is expected to have a vote on a trio of appropriation bills before the August recess. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
The White House is getting a new ballroom. Take a look at these preview photos. The $200 million project will be paid for by the president himself as well as private donors. And currently, in order to host an event of more than 200 people, the White House has to set up a tent on the lawn. The new ballroom will accommodate up to 650 people. It will replace the current East Wing, but not connect to the White House directly. The White House says it will match the theme and architectural heritage of the current buildings. Construction starts in September and is supposed to be wrapped up before President Trump's presidency ends. Over the crypto industry. Meanwhile, President Trump making clear that there will never be a central bank issued digital currency. Back to you.